Now, in order to have a unit that functions along the lines that people have suggested, where there is acceptance, where there's a lot of time spent one-to-one with patients psychotherapeutically and in groups, where they're validated, where they're listened to. Very basic concepts that in order for that to be acceptable, one, it has to be non-threatening to the rest of the hospital community. Now, when the unit first started, there were psychiatrists in the hospital that it was established at who had the sort of reactions that have been talked about here this morning, where there was raised eyebrows and shaking of heads and like borderline hell had just moved in. In fact, it's sort of interesting, but by not attacking, by not being overly defensive, by being warm, inviting, encouraging dialogue, giving appropriate information, research material, articles, books, etc., if they were requested, but certainly never attacking anyone for being a disbeliever or having a different paradigm. It's very interesting over the years just how many of those psychiatrists that were openly incredulous or dismissive have become stalwart admitters to the unit. In fact, I can remember one psychiatrist who was, this is going back more than a decade and a half, who rang me. At that stage he was a senior registrar, rang me, says something about the ambivalence about this area. He rang me saying he doesn't believe that DID exists, but nevertheless he's got a patient with it that he'd like to refer. That's called psychiatrist multiple reality disorder. And I've had the same version from patients in a slightly different take, which is the patient looking at me with fixed eyes and saying, I'm not multiple, but I think some of the others are. Or, alternatively, fixedly, we're not multiple. So, whatever it is about multiple realities, it affects us all. Also, it also became important that we establish international links. And I guess for many, many years I've been a long-term member of the International Society for the Study of Trauma and Dissociation. That didn't mean to say that I actually rushed into embracing some of the sort of adventuresome things that they did in the mid-90s. In fact, it's a strange relationship I've had. I feel quite warm, and I've had, at personal level, I've had a lot of collaborative contact with many people in the international field, have written chapters and books and done articles and edited journals and all of those sort of things with them. In fact, strangely enough, I think I'm the only person in the history of the society that was actually elected to fellowship, and I'm the only Australian in that grouping, without ever actually attending a meeting. Which sort of indicates, and there's a reasons for that, but it sort of indicates that to a fairly large degree I took from what was available, but kept a sceptical and inquiring mind about how far I went with some of the things that were being proposed. Over time too, it's important to have a good relationship with media, and that involves television media, news media, etc. I've also think it's incredibly important if you're actually subtly, essentially ushering in something that's an alternative paradigm, to do it in such a way that you don't appear overly threatening. And one of the difficulties that some people in the trauma field have had, I think, is that they've largely abandoned their contact with psychiatrists. And I've heard people in the trauma field say things like, I used to call myself a psychiatrist, but I'm not anymore. But to the average psychiatrist who's yet to actually pick up what this is about, it doesn't sound an inviting message. It just sounds like you're being dismissed as negligent or ignorant. And who'd want to join someone who lives in exile? So one of the things I've made a point of doing over the years is to maintain close contact with psychiatrists who may have no particular interest in trauma or dissociation. One of the things I do, for example, is sit on medical assessment tribunals through QComp, which is the Workers' Compensation Board assessment tribunals, and I've done that for a long, long time, which means I have a lot of contact with psychiatrists who work outside the field. But it also demonstrates that, that I'm not two-eyed, I'm not trying to personally defame them. And in fact, we very rarely talk about much to do with trauma and dissociation. It's a collegial activity in which there are particular sort of tasks that we share. But interestingly, a number of these people will refer patients or ask advice at times. Again, it's the same message. Be accepting, not threatening. Don't make it sound like you're a know-it-all or that you're being critical of their approach. Not everyone actually wants to be a trauma specialist. It's sort of interesting. People have talked today about the high percentage of mental health patients who have a history of trauma. The one other group, of course, who have similar trauma abuse histories, of course, is therapists. It's an interesting point, about the same percentages. I'm going to run through just a few pictures to remind us of a few things. Some have been mentioned already by others, but it won't hurt to see some of them again. Just to remind us just how much trouble Niccolo Machiavelli got into in essentially doing something radical, in talking about mankind as he is rather than as we wish he was, which is mankind is driven by a whole lot of desires that don't seem publicly acceptable. In fact, Frans de Waal, the primatologist, did the best study on the politics of a chimp colony back in the 70s, and he wrote a book called Chimpanzee Politics, which was based on intense, close observation of a chimp colony in Holland. And he came to the conclusion, to cut it very short, that chimp society is largely governed by the issues of power, food, and sex. Does that remind you of any other species? And of course, Thomas Hobbes pointed out long ago, and he was a survivor of the English Civil War, that when you take away, major authority, life is pretty short and brutal. And we've seen in the world just around us now just what happens when control evaporates in the Middle East, for example, and suddenly you've got full-on tribal warfare. Caesar Borgia, who was the model for Machiavelli's prince. He had some interesting advice, Machiavelli. He said to the prince, when you first come to power and you've conquered the land, send out an edict, first thing up, kill all the lawyers. Interesting one. He also said, get your atrocities over early. Don't string them out. It unsettles the populace. This is just to remind me of what was happening in the popular press back in the early 90s at a time when incest in the scientific press was so little reported on. And yet, virtually every day you saw newspaper articles about childhood trauma. It's sort of interesting that the popular press is so frequently ahead of us in actually bringing attention to an issue that the scientific community has yet to catch up with. I'm going to come to this a bit later, but the same thing has been happening in regard to one of the most completely unrecognised mental health issues in contemporary world psychiatry or contemporary society, and that is, it's not just the existence of DID that represents a very challenging population, but within the DID group or complex trauma group, there is another group whose issues have never been described in the scientific literature, and that's the subgroup where the incestuous abuse never ends, where it continues on into adulthood, decade after decade after decade. And again, we're getting in clinical imagination, we think, well, it's like it used to be about DID. You never see one of these cases in a million years. And in fact, as far as I can tell, and I won't go into a lot of detail about it, but about 1 in 8 patients with DID is still being incestuously abused as an adult, and that the Joseph Fritzls of the world are actually, not all of them dig dungeons, but the general dynamics are extraordinarily common, to the point where I would estimate that about 1 in 1,000 in the population is in that particular category. An enormous challenge. And again, when we, in terms of that, sorry, I'll just go back to that. I talked about 20 years ago about, you know, de novo discovering DID in Australia, in an Australian general hospital, and just to remind us of just how grotesque the traumas of many patients can be, and how some of them can be very well documented. This next picture, and I'm trying not to I'm not doing it to shock you. It's just this is just a picture of, and look away if you're going to be. It's a picture of the head of a man who cut off his own head with a circular saw, who was the principal abuser of this first particular patient with DID that had so mystified me, but in fact was abused in a mainstream church within suburban Brisbane. So look away. I'll just put it up very briefly. Sorry. And all of which was totally verifiable. If you go to look for any evidence in the literature or the newspaper or the internet, it's completely vanished. It's amazing how we managed to bury the most extreme traumas. Contemporary issues at the time all this was going on, of course, was the emergence of sexual abuse in therapists. And that's Jules Masserman, who was at the time considered the most famous psychiatrist in the world, who subsequently was deregistered for sexually abusing multiple patients, sued for millions, and then wrote a polemic and suicided. And he was had been president of the American Psychiatric Association. And so at that point, I think people started to realise that there was a problem, that basically in any organisation or grouping where abuse can happen, it will happen.